What if I told you the greatest civilization in history should have never existed? Look at Egypt today, and all you see is endless desert. So how did people build giant pyramids, powerful cities, and one of the richest kingdoms the world has ever known? Here is the thing. None of it started with kings or pyramids. It all started with one river that refused to stop flowing. And honestly, without that river, there would be no Egypt at all. Alright, so before we talk about pyramids, pharaohs, or giant temples, we have to meet the real hero of Egypt's story. It wasn't a king. It wasn't an army. It wasn't even the people. It was a river. And yeah, that river changed everything. Look, when most people think about Egypt, they picture huge deserts stretching as far as the eye can see, sand everywhere, almost no rain, hot days that seem to never end. It feels like the last place where a great civilization could ever grow. But do not let that fool you. Right in the middle of all that dry land, one river kept flowing year after year. That river gave people fresh water, food, rich land, and a chance to build a future. That is a big deal. So here is the thing. If you could travel back more than 7,000 years, Egypt would look very different from what you see today. There were no pyramids reaching into the sky, no giant statues, no famous temples. There was only a long river cutting through a sea of sand, and that single river became the center of everything. Look, the Nile is one of the longest rivers on Earth. It begins thousands of miles away in the highlands of East Africa and areas around Lake Victoria. Along the way, smaller rivers join together until they become one powerful river that keeps moving north. Pretty wild, right? Most rivers flow south because people think down means south. The Nile does the opposite. It flows north, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. That surprises a lot of people. Okay, so imagine standing on the banks of the Nile thousands of years ago. The air is warm. Birds are flying over the water. Fish are jumping near the shore. Tall green plants sway in the breeze, while boats slowly drift across the calm river. Now turn around. Only a short walk away, there is nothing but dry desert. It almost feels like two different worlds living side by side. That is exactly what made Egypt so special. Yeah, so almost every person in ancient Egypt lived close to this river. They built their homes near it. They raised their children beside it. They planted their crops along its banks. They traveled on it almost every day. The farther you moved away from the Nile, the harder life became. Look, today, many countries have roads connecting cities. Ancient Egypt had the Nile. The river was their highway. People used simple wooden boats to carry food, animals, stone, tools, and people from one place to another. Going north was easy because the river carried them that way. Coming back south was also possible because strong winds pushed their sails in the opposite direction. Honestly, it was like nature built them a two-way transportation system. That made life much easier. So here is the thing. The Nile did something even more amazing. Every year, the river overflowed its banks. At first, that might sound like bad news. Floods usually destroy things. But the Nile's floods were different. Instead of leaving behind destruction, the water left behind thick black mud that was packed with nutrients. That fresh soil made the land perfect for growing crops. People did not need modern fertilizers. Nature did the work for them. That black soil became one of Egypt's greatest treasures. The ancient Egyptians even gave it a special name. They called their land Kemet, which means the Black Land. The desert around it was called the Red Land because of its endless red and yellow sand. Just those two names tell you everything about Egypt. One side gave life, the other side tested it, and that difference shaped the entire country. Look, every year families waited for the flood season almost like people today wait for spring. They knew that when the water came, another year of life was on its way. No flood meant trouble. A weak flood meant smaller harvests. No harvest meant hunger. Everything depended on that river, every single year. That is why the Nile was never just a river. It was life itself. Okay, so, once the floodwaters slowly pulled back, something amazing happened. The land looked completely different. What had been covered with water was now covered with rich, dark soil. It was soft, fresh, and perfect for growing food. People did not waste a single day. Families walked into the fields with simple wooden tools and started planting seeds almost right away. They knew this was their chance. Look, the two biggest crops were wheat and barley. Wheat was used to make bread, and bread was one of the most important foods in ancient Egypt. Barley was used for food too, but it was also used to make beer. Yeah, beer. That might sound strange today, but back then beer was part of everyday life. Adults drank it, workers drank it, and sometimes even children had a weaker version because the river water was not always safe to drink. It gave people energy and was often cleaner than standing water. Pretty wild, right? So here is the thing. Farming was not just about throwing seeds into the ground and hoping for the best. People watched the river very carefully. They learned when the floods usually came. They learned how long the water stayed. They learned the best time to plant and the best time to harvest. Year after year, they passed that knowledge down to their children. That simple pattern became the heartbeat of Egypt. Look, the ancient Egyptians even divided their whole year around the Nile. The first season was the flood season, when the river covered the fields. The second season was the growing season, when crops slowly filled the land with green. The third season was the harvest season, when families gathered the food they had worked so hard to grow. Everything followed the river's schedule, not the other way around. Yeah, so, because the Nile kept bringing fresh soil every year, the land stayed healthy for a very long time. Farmers did not have to move from place to place looking for better land like many other early people did. They could stay in one place, build stronger homes, raise bigger families, create lasting communities. That changed everything. Look, food does more than fill your stomach. When people have enough food, they have time to do other things. Some become builders, some become potters, others become fishermen, traders, artists, or leaders. That is exactly what happened in Egypt. The Nile gave people enough food to dream bigger. That is how civilizations begin. Okay, so the river did not only help farmers, it was also full of life. Fish filled the water almost all year. People caught them using simple nets, hooks made from bone, and handmade traps. Fish became an important part of everyday meals, especially for families living close to the river. The Nile was like a giant kitchen that never completely ran out of food. That is a big deal. Look, the riverbanks were also home to many animals. Birds flew across the wetlands in huge groups. Ducks and geese rested near the water. Hunters quietly waited for the right moment to catch them. Hippos lived in some parts of the river, and crocodiles waded beneath the surface. Now honestly, a crocodile was one of the last things you wanted to meet. These animals could easily flip a small boat or attack someone collecting water. People respected them because they knew how dangerous they were. The Nile gave life. But it also demanded respect. Yeah, so, besides food, the river also gave people useful plants. One of the most important was papyrus. At first glance, it just looked like a tall green plant growing near the water. But do not let that fool you. Papyrus was one of the greatest gifts the Nile ever gave Egypt. People used it to make ropes. They made baskets. They made sandals. They made mats. They even built small boats from bundles of papyrus tied together. But its most famous use was something even bigger: writing. Look, workers cut the papyrus stems into thin strips. They laid the strips across each other, pressed them together, and let them dry. The result was a smooth surface that people could write on. It was one of the world's first writing materials. Think about that for a second. Without papyrus, Many of Egypt's stories might have disappeared forever. Okay, so the Nile was also Egypt's main road. There were no highways, no trains, no trucks. If someone wanted to move heavy stone for a building project, they used boats. If farmers wanted to sell extra grain, they used boats. If leaders wanted to send messages to another town, they used boats. The river connected north and south like one long highway stretching across the country. It brought people together. Look, traveling on land was slow and difficult. The desert was hot, dry, and dangerous. Carrying heavy supplies across loose sand was exhausting. The river solved that problem. A boat could carry far more than people could carry on their backs. That made trade faster. It made travel easier, and it helped small villages stay connected. That simple river slowly turned scattered communities into one growing civilization. That was the beginning of something incredible. Yeah, so, as villages became larger, people started helping each other in new ways. Some families focused on farming, others made tools, some became skilled at building boats, others learned how to shape clay into strong pots for storing grain and water. Everyone had a job. Everyone depended on someone else, and all of them depended on the Nile. That connection made Egypt stronger every year. Look, people also noticed something very important. The river did not always flood exactly the same way. Some years the water rose higher. Some years it stayed lower. Too much water could damage fields. Too little water could ruin crops. So communities worked together to dig small canals and simple water channels. These helped move water where it was needed and saved some of it for later. It was not fancy, but it was smart, and it showed that people were learning how to work with nature instead of fighting against it. That lesson would shape Egypt for thousands of years.